Hello everyone, welcome to another Texas Star video. In this video I'll be using scrap wood to make this Texas Star with perfect miter joints. And yes, I will be teaching you how to get those perfect joints because it is kind of tricky. I'm going to be talking a lot about the angles I use. I'm going to talk about the jigs and some of the changes I've made since my previous videos. And I'm going to use a new joinery technique which is actually very convenient for assembling these. And no, I'm not using pocket hole screws, so stay tuned for that. And I'll talk a little bit about the staining process as well. So this is a long and juicy video, but it is jam-packed full of information, so let's get started. This is the piece of wood that I'll be using today. It is a combination of cedar, pine, and fir glued together. But of course, you can just use a regular 1x4 for this project. And this piece of wood is about 28 inches long. This is the miter saw I'll be using today. Now, over the last few weeks, I've learned that there are many different ways to cut the angles to a Texas Star. So if you want to see all the different ways I've discovered, definitely check out my channel. But for this video, you'll start by setting your saw at 45 degrees. And this is a good way of cutting it if you have a saw that only goes to 45. I know I have a bigger saw here and I could go beyond that, and there are videos where I've cut stars starting at 54 degrees, but we're going to stick to 45 today. So obviously that first step is pretty easy. Cut a 45 in the end there. And then you're going to keep your board at the same angle because you're going to make your next 45 degree cut parallel to this one. But how do you know how long to cut this? And I've had a few questions. People asking me like, hey, what are the angles and how long do you cut them when you're dealing with a 3-inch board, 3-inch wide board versus a 3.5-inch or a 4-inch? And so I thought I'd speak to that. So the angles stay the same no matter what. Doesn't matter how wide this board is, you're using the same angles. Now to figure out how long to cut this, I finally figured out a little bit of a hack for that. Let me just find my measuring tape here. They make these things bright orange, and yet they're still hard to find. Anyways, so to figure out how long to cut this, where to make your next cut, you come along here and you just measure the length of the angle you just cut. So this board, this board is 3 1/4 wide, but the angle that you cut, or that I cut here, is 4 5/8. And this edge is basically going to become this edge of the star. And this edge will be the same as this one here. So basically, I'm going to mark 4 5/8 on this side. And that's where I'll make my next cut. Although, I like to add an extra eighth, just in case. Little room for error, you know? So I'll cut it at 4 6/8. And just as an example here, this one was made with a 3-inch wide board. That's 3 inches there. People seem to ask me a lot about the 3-inch board, so I'm assuming maybe they're getting like 1x4 pallet wood or something that's in terrible condition, and maybe they're running them through a joiner and then ripping them through a table saw and losing half an inch, and you end up with 3 inches. That's pretty much what I did here. Maybe that's why I keep getting questions about the 3-inch star. I'm not sure. Or board, sorry. But anyways, so this was the angle. And if you measure here, that's 4 3/8. And I ended up cutting it at 4 1/2, just to give me a little extra room for error there. So that's basically what you do. And if you have a 4-inch wide board or a 5-inch wide board, you can do the same thing. Just measure that, mark it over here, and then you know how long to cut these. And now that we've got these 5 pieces cut, we've essentially got all the angles cut to the outer perimeter of the star. And we can now focus on the center angles here. So to do that, the next step will be to set your saw up at 31.6. Now originally, I was setting it at 31.5 in some of my previous videos, because mathematically 31.5 is correct. But I find that with some of the very minor inaccuracies, when joining the 10 facets together, 31.6 just seemed to work better. And that's actually what I cut this star at here. I just did this one a few days ago as kind of just a trial run for this video. And it all fits together really nicely. Front and back. We don't have any major gaps in the center or the outer portions there. So, I'll try to talk a little bit more about that after I set up my jigs. Alright, so here is my cool jig setup here. I keep modifying this every time I make a video because I keep wanting to make a better one. So let's just call this my prototype here. And yeah, I'll just talk about it, and we'll talk about those inaccuracies that I mentioned there. So basically, this just slides right in there, and I'm able to clamp it down to hold it in place. And I've got it set at 31.6, and you know, just come down, do a chop, open this up, flip it over, and do another chop there, and you'll end up with these 2 angles here. And here's a close-up of the jig I made here. I just used some scrap 1x4s, put this toggle clamp on top. I cut this at 45 degrees, and I cut a little notch in here, and that's just so that sawdust doesn't kind of throw off the alignment. So there's basically room for sawdust to go into it when I slide this in. And let me see here. This thing is adjustable. I kept those separate so I can move it back and forth for different size stalks. And to line up where I'm going to cut, same theory as when you're dealing with measuring that angle there. So I basically just kind of line this zero clearance thing up to the edge of my blade, and then line up that corner to be just right over that edge. And that's where I clamp everything together. And one thing that I have not done in previous videos is I added this piece here. But not only am I going to add this piece, I'm going to add 4 strips of masking tape right over here, so that I've got a perfectly flat surface and 0 flex going down there. Now, I don't know why I didn't notice this before. I keep learning random new things here. But in some of my previous videos when I was cutting this, I would basically just put a piece of wood here at 45 degrees and just clamp it in, and basically didn't use any jigs. But I didn't realize that this red piece here was lower than the aluminum over here. So I was also getting just like a minor bevel, and things were not quite lining up properly. So as you can see, with the force of the blade going downwards, it's wanting to tip my piece, even with the toggle clamp, because the toggle clamp isn't like super powerful or anything. So at first, I was just putting a strip of 4 strips of masking tape over here to compensate for that little lip there. And as you can see, that actually made a huge difference. And then I added this. So there seems to be a purpose for everything with this jig. And I just wanted to point that out because I find that any minute little error will kind of magnify with the end result. So stars are not easy to put together, and this helps. Little things like this help. So let's talk a little bit more about those inaccuracies. The most notable one is that I've got a little bit of movement here when I make my cuts. So even though this piece is clamped down, when I bring my blade down to make my cut, the force of the blade is pushing my piece of wood this way. And although it feels pretty solid, there's still a slight bit of movement in there. Let me just zoom in there. So when I wiggle it with my thumb a little bit, you can see there's some slight movement in there. It might just be 0.5 millimeter or so, but that's enough to throw all your angles off. But I think what's happening is when I set it at 31.6, it's compensating for this minor error. And the reason that it does become a problem in the end is because you're joining 10 different facets together. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but any minute mistake will amplify in the end product. The other thing is actually trying to find 31.5 here. It's not really an easy angle to set up on a miter saw. So there are some flaws with using a miter saw for cutting stars. I think that's why some people use a table saw. But I think that's a little bit more of an advanced process, which I haven't looked into too much, but I can now see why some people might use a table saw over a miter saw for cutting stars. All right, I guess we can get to cutting now. And once you got your first cut done, just flip this piece over. And do it again. And you've got one piece there. So I'm going to repeat that times 5, and we should have all our pieces to the star. All right, if you're still watching, you've made it to the halfway point of this video. I just thought I'd take a moment to thank all my viewers out there. I've been growing this channel slowly but surely, and I'm hoping you're finding some of this information useful. If you are, please consider subscribing. I know some of my explanations can be kind of lengthy, but I always found that I learned the most from other content creators when they provided the most detail-oriented information. So that's kind of what I want to provide to my viewers as well. All right, let's see what the star looks like. The initial fitting is always a little bit nerve-wracking, but I have a good feeling about this. I think we've spent a lot of time setting things up. Yep, there we go. So that is actually a really nice fit there. But if you don't get a perfect fit on your first try, don't worry about it. Sometimes you do have some gaps, and they actually are fixable. So as long as you know how to fix it, it's not a big deal. So the first problem you can run into is when you get a gap that's going more towards the center of the star. So you go to put it together, and the gap is kind of in this area over here. Now, if this happens, all you have to do is move your saw just slightly over to the right a little bit, more towards 31.7. If your gap is more towards the outer portion of the star, you move it to the left, more towards 31.5. In both cases, you're also going to need to move your jig setup over to the right, about 2 millimeters or so that you can shave the entire angle again. Otherwise, you kind of end up with like a curved shape to your edge if you don't do that. So I usually aim for about half the thickness of the blade. And to glue this thing together, I'm just using Tight Bond 3, and I've got a piece of parchment paper there, and basically I just run some strips of glue along the edges, and I try to make it so that I squeeze the glue out the back of the star and onto the parchment paper. Interestingly enough, it actually creates a little bit of suction and just holds the pieces in place there. And I actually just leave it there to dry for a couple of hours. And it does have to be parchment paper, not wax paper. The parchment paper will peel off quite nicely once it's dried. And I highly recommend you using wood glue as opposed to the hot glue gun. It just gives you a lot more time to move your pieces around and get them into the perfect position. The hot glue gun dries too quickly. So after letting the glue set for a couple of hours, it's time to reinforce the star. Now in some of my previous videos, I've done this by gluing and nailing a piece of plywood on the back. I also did another video where I experimented with spline joints. Some of you might call them loose tenon joints. Not quite sure, but you can go check out that video and see for yourself there. Now I found the plywood was a very quick and easy way to reinforce these. Unfortunately, I was finding that I was getting some cupping at the back of the star, and I don't know if that had to do with the plywood and glue not allowing for the natural expansion and contraction of wood, causing it to just slightly cup. I think most people probably wouldn't notice it, but I did, and it was starting to bug me, which is why I experimented with the spline joints, which worked really well. Didn't have any warping or cupping or anything. It's a super strong way to do it. I'll try to get a shot on the screen here. But the thing is, a little bit too complicated, and trying to slide them together when gluing, the glue actually tacked up quite quickly, and it was very difficult to slide the pieces into place. I think if I were to make a very large star, I might maybe use that system, but for smaller stars, I was looking for something a little quicker and easier. So then I started looking into pocket holes, but I've never really been a fan of pocket hole screws because it doesn't form an actual bond, like a wood-to-wood bond with glue. And that's where I came up with this idea, to make my own pocket hole jig that drilled smaller holes, with the idea of inserting a dowel into it, a dowel and glue, instead of just a wood screw. And I think you got a glimpse of it earlier. It looks something like this. You end up getting a pretty neat and tidy look to the back of it, and you've got a really strong bond with a 2-inch long dowel going through each piece here. And I was actually really impressed with how well that worked out. Now for the dowels, I'm actually using barbecue skewers. And this is something I've been doing for a while now, experimenting with bamboo barbecue skewers, bamboo marshmallow sticks. You can usually buy them for really cheap at the dollar store, and they bond really well with the glue. So let's go ahead and try this thing out. I'll show you how I clamp it down, drill the holes, and put these dowels in there. So to use this awesome little jig here, basically design it so all you have to do is line up this corner with this corner over here and clamp it down and drill your hole. So that's the setup there. And this is the back of the star, by the way. And the size of your drill bit will depend on the diameter of your skewer. And of course, they differ from brand to brand. So I think you're just going to have to do your own trial and error on that one. Go out and buy some bamboo skewers, or maybe you want to use some higher quality dowels, whatever you want. Purchase a extra long bit, and you can try the system out yourself. So let's just zoom in and take a closer look here. You'd notice there's a nut on my bit there, and that's how I know how far to go in. Basically, as soon as the nut hits the edge of that jig, I know where to stop. And on to the next piece here. It's just a really simple system. Just clamp it on and move on to the next piece. I don't really have to line too much up. And because I've already pre-glued the pieces together, nothing's sliding out of alignment. It's very convenient. So I've got everything ready to glue my dowels in, and basically I've just pre-cut them at 2 inches long. And yeah, I'll just get some glue into here and smear some glue on this one. And just stick it in there. Now, I do like to make sure there's lots of glue in there. I want to make sure we get that good bond. So I usually go in a couple of times. There we go. I can feel it getting pretty sticky there. There we are. So that's pretty much it. Goes in smoothly. I'll let this dry, and then I'll cut off the excess with a pull saw. And in case you're wondering how strong this joint is, well, I just did a basic sloppy butt joint here with just glue, and tested my little dowel system here, and I have not been able to break that. So either I'm really weak or this is really strong, and pretty sure it's the latter. I don't know why anyone needs a super strong star like this, but hey, at least I know I built it well. And once the excess pieces were all trimmed down with my pull saw, I sanded them down with my orbital sander and got a very smooth flat surface there. And then it was time for a little putty work. Basically mixed some wood glue and fine sawdust and just kind of smeared it into some of the fine cracks there. And then sanded it off with my orbital sander again. And I'm just using 150 grit here. And as you can see, that took care of any minute little micro gaps there. It was already looking pretty good. I probably didn't need much. And once I was satisfied with the sanding, it was time for staining. The staining process was a little different than what I usually do. I ended up using 3 different types of stain from Minwax, the golden oak on the pine there, and some provincial and special walnut for the darker sections there. I can't actually remember which one was which. They were both very similar, and the results were also varying based on the type of wood there, because I do have a few different types of wood there. But yeah, I just was kind of going for something colorful and rustic. In this section here, I'm basically just doing a blend. I didn't want it super dark. I didn't want it super light or reddish like cedar sometimes turns out. So I just kind of used the corner of the rag just to blend it a little bit, or streak it, I should say. And then I used golden oak over top of that. I think the first one was the special walnut, then golden oak, and it just kind of blended it in together. So there's a little bit of trial and error here for sure, but I actually quite like the way it worked out. And the pine, the golden oak on the pine was a little light, so I ended up adding some special walnut over top of that just to darken it up a little bit. And this is what we're left with. And when using stain, you always have to wipe up the excess with a dry rag when you're done, prior to putting a varnish on. And that's what this is here. This is a rub-on varnish. It's a 50-50 mix of mineral spirits and an oil-based polyurethane. And same thing as the stain, you do need to wipe off the excess with a dry rag afterwards. And I ended up putting 3 coats on. So I did have to, I waited a few hours in between coats. And once I was happy with the sheen, I took it outside to air dry. Nice. Ended up getting some really nice joints there. Really nice fitting miters. So that's pretty much it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know what you think about this style of star. I hadn't made one with strips of wood like this before. I am curious to know what you think. And stay tuned for more videos. If you liked the video, please subscribe, like, share, do all that fun stuff. Thanks again, and see you next time.